Welcome. This is Resolving Reality, an independent Irish media platform. In this first video episode, I interviewed John Waters, who is an author, public speaker, and former journalist who spent many years working in the mainstream media in Ireland, including a 14-year spell at the Irish Times newspaper as a regular columnist. Visit John's website, www.johnwaters.ie, and John's latest book, Give Us Back the Bad Roads, is available from Currach Press on the currachbooks.com website. That's www.currachbooks.com, and you can find those links down below in the description. In this interview, we discuss the beginnings of his career, political correctness and cultural Marxism in the Irish media, the attitude and unprofessionalism of mainstream media employees, how he was treated for going against the grain, the reasons for his change in mindset, and why he left the world of mainstream journalism behind. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and check out the Resolving Reality website, www.resolvingreality.com. Great. Well, first of all, John, thanks for agreeing to take the time. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
So you're known for many different things. You're known for being an author, a spokesperson, a public speaker, and a songwriter even. But journalism is mostly what you're known for. So how and why did you get into journalism?
I got into Currach Press. I mean, I always wanted to be a journalist, or I wanted to be a writer of some kind. I wasn't sure exactly how or what, and I wanted to be a journalist, I suppose. And then I tried to get into newspapers. At that time, there was no really colleges or whatever. We're talking about like the 1980s, even the 70s. And I wrote to some newspapers and asked them if they had any jobs, and I got very dismaying and patronising letters back. I have one or two of them actually still, and they're quite funny, telling me, that how sad. I haven't got my own letters, but I got one from the Irish Independent which says, that your letter, really was deeply saddening and sorrowful, and I'm sure it was. I wish I had it. And but then I kind of went on into other jobs, and during the 70s, when I left school, I worked in CIE and the goods end of it, and then the school transport end of it as a clerk. I was a show band roadie, for a band. I was a petrol pump attendant for a while. That was probably my best paid job, actually. And then I was, so I was doing different things like that. And then I took over my father's mail car run, in County Roscommon, and I did that for a few years, and that was a great experience. I wrote my first book, Driving at the Crossroads, really based on that whole experience. And that's kind of, so when Currach Press came along in the 70s, I love music, and I used to read the NME, the New Musical Express, and Melody Maker, and all those, the English ones, and was really fascinated by that, particularly during the punk era and afterwards, where they had become highly politicized, and so I used to really read those very closely every week, and there was amazing stuff. It's amazing education. Compared to now, those papers were astonishing. There would be like 8-page interviews with David Bowie and Brian Eno and people like that.
Wow, yeah. Really inspirational stuff.
Yeah, really in-depth stuff, like not just, the kind of narcissistic stuff you get now in those kind of papers, but really, because these guys were highly well-read people and really thinking about everything, like the whole nature of culture, where it was going. And then there was people they would interview people like Ken Livingstone, the Labour Party, a guy. He's subsequently been Lord Mayor of London, and Tony Benn was another great one, and I was fascinated by this. So when Currach Press came along, I couldn't believe it, because up to then all the music papers or magazines in Ireland had been so bad that you couldn't possibly write for them. Like, they were just rewritten press releases. Like there would be like an interview with Elvis Presley, which was concocted from 2 or 3 different interviews in other magazines. That was the level of it. So
very unoriginal.
So when Currach Press came along, then it was like astonishingly good, and the quality of writing was superb, and it was really something to aspire to, to write for this publication. And there was journalists like Bill Graham, like he's dead. He died in 1996, and very suddenly, and he was an absolute genius, and could actually contextualize rock and roll in all kinds of contexts, in Ireland, and make connections between all kinds of stuff, like between U2 and the first program for economic expansion, or like all kinds of stuff that was really amazing, and I couldn't get enough of this. So I kind of immediately wanted to write for it. This was kind of, I think, June 77 they started. And I actually had my first article in Hot Press in January 1998, so it was quite early on. And it was a review of Horselips in Ballahadreen in County Roscommon. But I didn't know what to do, so I just kept doing it, and I didn't know how to ring an editor. I mean, it's amazing now when you think about the communications you have. Like at that time, to make a call to Dublin from the west, I was from Castlereagh, but I was working at the time in Westport, in the railway station there, and like to make a call from Westport to Dublin would take you like half the day, because you would have to get all the appropriate number of coins, going on the shops changing money, and then finding a kiosk that actually worked, and then feeding the money in and hoping that the editor would come on the phone before the money ran out. And I actually never succeeded in speaking to the editor, and then I had given up. I did a number of articles, some would be published, some wouldn't. I just kept putting them in, but then there was a long period and nothing was published, and I thought, it's not looking good. Maybe it's because I don't type. So I got a typewriter and I learned to type, and I'm going to write one article and it's going to be so good and it's going to be typed perfectly that they won't have any excuse. And I did that, and it was a review of a band called Bagatelle, who were kind of a pop band at the time, we're talking now early 80s, and I wrote this review of them playing in Longford, and was certain. I typed it all up so carefully, it took me days, and I sent it off and said, definitely this is going in. And the following week I went out and bought Hot Press, and you've thrown this up Bagatelle, there they are, by Bill Graham. And I thought, phew. So I gave up. And 6 months later I got a letter from the editor, Niall Stokes, saying, we really liked that Bagatelle review, and we just couldn't run it because Bill had done something.
See, okay.
So, but would you do some more? And I just couldn't believe it, and that was the start. And it was that close, I had given up. I'd moved on.
Wow.
And he kind of called me back. I mean, he was a really good editor, Niall, actually. I mean, we had different politics and different things going on between us, but he was without him, I wouldn't have got a start. Maybe he regrets it now, but because he's a bit of a lefty. But he was a great editor.
That's amazing. I wanted to ask you how, because I know a bit about the rest of your career, but it's interesting talking about the early days, because like from what I know of you as a person and your outlook on things now compared to the media, they're opposite in different worlds, and you kind of got in there for more, because of music in a way and the more artistic side of things. But I suppose you didn't know at that stage what the career would become in the end,
No idea at all. I mean, to write for Hot Press was dream enough, and a dream come true, and I remember I was driving the mail car at the time, I used to have a green Hiace van, and the proudest part of it was I had a sticker from Hot Press which on the back window which said, keeping Ireland safe for rock and roll. And that was like, they were great days. That was the early 1980s. They were a time in Ireland when everything was up for grabs. Everything was kind of potentially great. Anything could have happened.
Yeah.
Economically a bit not so good, but culturally, the kind of counterculture of the time was very rich. Lots of magazines, the theatre was rich, music was rich. That was where, you had the early days of U2, you had all kinds of acts coming out, and amazing kind of excitement and possibility in those years, So it was, and there was lots of festivals every summer. Like there was festivals all summer long. We would go driving around the country, at the weekends, going to all these places that nobody had ever thought of having a festival before, and suddenly there were 50,000 people in a field, and amazing time, amazing country.
Did you kind of know back then that, well, you know, later when you went to the Times then, or maybe it was a gradual thing for you personally, because I know we all mature and it takes a while to grow up and catch on to how things work in the world. And, you know, when you got to the Times then, was it like, did you know back in those days that things were starting to go wrong in the media, or was it a gradual thing? Like, was the heat being turned up gradually, or did it just happen?
I have to be honest and say I hadn't the faintest idea that there was anything wrong, you know, because I think, first of all, you got to remember that we were coming out of the 50s, 60s period, when there was this perception, especially when we were young and we were kind of, you know, the tendency of young people is to oppose the old and to, you know, turn over, to create a revolution of sorts. And that was kind of what we thought was going on. And so I didn't really bat an eyelid. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we were kind of, that was in Hot Press, or, you know, generally everybody had the same outlook, you know, let's give this place a shaking up, you know, and we wanted to, you know, we wanted to do stuff and we wanted to go places, and we didn't want to be restricted by priests or bishops, for sure, all that stuff. That was kind of in the ether. And, you know, I was part of that. You know, it was never anything, people have a misunderstanding, you know, they think that what happens is you become conservative or you become right-wing. That is not what happened to me in any sense whatsoever. I don't regard myself as in any way conservative or in any way right-wing, certainly not. I think I see what I do now and the things I say as a continuation of what I felt, what I was essentially trying to do in the beginning, which is try to kind of create fairness and justice in the world, you know, and to speak for those who didn't have a voice and who were being mistreated.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so that was what I saw rock and roll as being, and Hot Press seemed to me to be doing that at the time. And and then when I went into, I mean, I became a magazine editor very soon. I came to Dublin in 1984 with Hot Press. They offered me a full-time job, and I took that. And no sooner did I come up, I'd already started to write these interviews, political interviews, and not just political, but kind of in-depth interviews with all kinds of personalities, journalists and artists and so on. And they were beginning to get attention in other publications, you know, because they were very unusual, you know, and they were unusual actually, strangely, because I actually adapted the idea from a religious magazine called The Word, which is published in Dunamon, County Roscommon, edited by a brother called Brother Paul, who's a fantastic man, you know, and he's dead now, God be good to him, and he used to interview all these public figures, like, at great length, and asked them really, not intimate personal questions, but questions about their thoughts and their experiences and their lives, and I found it endlessly fascinating. My father had boxes of them, you know, and all my childhood I was reading these, you know. And
yeah, a lot of substance to them.
Yeah, and I wanted to do the same thing, and I kind of brought that into Hot Press and started doing. So it was beginning to get attention elsewhere, and I did lots of those kind of things from the West as well, and Jerry Adams and people like, there's a journalist called John Feeney, which is my favourite. He died in a plane crash subsequently, and but I just thought he was such an amazing and strange character, and I did this interview, which is extremely funny, you know, and it got a lot of attention. And of course the Charlie Haughey interview then got a lot of attention because he used bad language, a big deal, you know, but everybody went crazy. And so that was kind of what I was at the time. But when I then in Dublin, I started to meet other people that had been writing about stuff I was writing, you know, and I would just run into them and they'd say, oh, you're him, you're that guy from Hot Press, and we'd get talking, and eventually I ended up talking to Vincent Brown, who was asking, and so he asked me to write for the Sunday Tribune, and I started doing a radio column for them, and it's a very long story, but anyway, I did in the end end up writing a radio column, and subsequently he started a TV guide. He was trying to break the monopoly of the TV listings ownership by these television stations, which he succeeded in doing eventually. So he started this thing called the McGill TV Guide, and I was the editor. And boy, was that torture, and but it was fun as well in a strange retrospective kind of way. And then I became editor of In Dublin, and subsequently then Brown made me editor of McGill, which was like unbelievable to me. Well, 4 years after I came to Dublin, having been driving a mail car, I was editor of McGill. Like, I mean, we'd been watching him on the Late Late Show just 5 years before from Castlereagh. Yeah, like he was kind of this extraordinary figure, and here I was now doing the job he'd been doing, which was unbelievable. Like, so it kind of all happened very fast, and I don't think I don't have any sense of any of my outlook changing in that period in the 1980s. Up to the time my father died in 89, I think that's kind of a piece, with Hot Press and all the other, in Dublin, like, was a kind of very much a lefty, feminist oriented LGBT stuff, the first publication in Ireland to do serious LGBT stuff, and I was editor of that, and it was completely kind of, all about freedom of that particular kind, and that's sort of the crux of it for me, was to actually come to the realization eventually that freedom was a misplaced understanding of freedom. So how that kind of happened, I've told it a few times, but that there were kind of three fundamental things that changed my understanding of freedom and what was at stake. The first was it happened in the late 80s, 88, 89 and 90, come to terms with the fact that I was an alcoholic and trying to stop drinking, and that really taught me something fundamental about myself, that alcoholism, through Alcoholics Anonymous, and they introduce you to God as we understand him. And that was a big leap for me, because I kind of left all that stuff behind, but I began to see what they were talking about.
The value of it.
Because you see, the thing is that they were basically saying to me, it wasn't that they were saying you've lived a bad life, now you need to get on your knees. That was not the point. That was a misunderstanding. That would have been, and it was my initial understanding. It was that, no, you've misunderstood yourself. You've misunderstood your structure as a human being.
Oh, well, yeah.
And the God thing is the fundamental missing part that goes right in there. It's like the central kind of, the kernel of your being that you've forgotten. And if you can rediscover that and polish it up, you'll find that your life changes and you change. And it did. That's what happened.
And that was the solution to the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just stand back from it and think of it, yes. I mean, on the simple basis that, I do not generate myself in this moment. Something else does. I need to be aware of that. And if I stop being aware of that, then I'm going to go completely off the rails, or the risk is that I will.
And that's where the other things stem from, like leading towards alcohol or other things.
Exactly,
is the lack of perception of the self, I suppose. And
it's kind of complicated, and it's probably too much to go into in an interview like this. But I've written about it at length in a book I wrote called Lapsed Agnostic. Back in, that's a good few years ago now. But so that was the first thing. The second thing was then again in 1990 when I went to the Irish Times. The revolutions had happened in Eastern Europe, and the Velvet Revolution had happened in Prague, and I had been for a long time watching Prague and listening to the Radio Praha and reading Václav Havel and people like that, and all the great Czech novelists of the time, Hrabal and Klima and Kundera and people like that. And I
were definitely aware of what was happening
there.
Yeah,
so I asked to be sent out, and I was sent out then to cover the first free elections in Prague in 1990. And that was an amazing experience. I spent several weeks there, and when I was there I met this guy called Ivan Šrek, who was a Czech guy, about my own age, and he had a little apartment just off the main street, one of the main streets in Prague, called Narodny Street, which was where the revolution started. And there's a big long story about the revolution, that it may have actually been, the whole thing may have been set up by the KGB in order to provoke a situation where they could replace the hardline Prague government with the softline government. And the plot was that a student would pretend to be dead, somebody posing as a student would pretend to be dead, lie down, and that this would provoke the people to come onto the streets, and then they would put in their puppet.
That's an old trick. Yeah,
but at the last minute the puppet pulled out, and Havel stepped in. And so at this point where the student was supposed to have fallen, they built an altar. The people built an altar, and they would put candles on it. That is a tradition in Eastern Europe. They put candles on every day, and literally thousands of candles. And Ivan, who lived around the corner, got the job of taking away the candle wax which flowed onto the street, onto the roadway. And he brought it back into his apartment, and he had boxes of it, and he didn't know what to do with it. And he decided that he got these cast iron busts of the communist leaders, Stalin and Lenin, and Clement Gottwald, who was the Czech equivalent. And he made candle wax busts of these guys. And we used to have, he and I had been debating, because he was like same age as me, but a different experience. And I was coming with this soft lefty stuff to him, and saying, well, socialism is essentially a good impulse of man seeking to create equality and distribute.
Yeah, make things more fair and...
Yeah, all that, yeah. And he was having none of it. He just says, no, it is a very dangerous idea. He says it is the most dangerous idea that we've ever thought of in the human species. That was his position, and I thought it was nonsense, but we were just at cross purposes, and we got on very well at one level, but we were always arguing, and we didn't really resolve this. And when I was going home, he came with me in the taxi to the airport, and on his knees he had a cardboard box in the taxi, and I said, what's in the box? And he says, you'll find out. And so we got to the airport, and he presented me with the box, and opened it up, and it was these heads, and they were quite big, they were kind of, and he says, very simple sentence, he says, you must take to Ireland the heads of the socialist murderers. Wow. That was like a punch in the solar plexus for me, because that not just knocks the wind out of you, it knocks all the bullshit out of you. Because that was just the nature, that the dynamic of that phrase seemed to be like a bullet.
Yeah.
And
he knew what he was doing as well.
Yeah. So that I went home. I went on that. I just thought, it's time to revisit all this stuff. So that was the second day, and I started to then reconsider. But what really copper-fastened the whole thing was then 6 years later, when I became a father in quite difficult circumstances, and a single father, and I had a daughter, Roisin, who's now 22, and she, was born in England, and I was still in Ireland, and it was very tricky. I had to, remortgage my house and buy a house over there, and lots of stuff. And anyway, I can't really talk about that too much because of in-camera regulations and so on. But the essential point was that I started to write about it. Now, I had actually written about it before it happened to me. I'd written a play called Long Black Coat in 1993. It was put on in 94. And it was all about this, about the crisis of fatherhood. And it was a conversation between an old man and a young man who were themselves father and son about the absence of the son and grandson from them at a time when there was actually a nuclear war type situation going on. And so it was like, apocalyptic in all kinds of ways. And so here I was, 96, 2 years later, it was happening to me. And my response, as I've said, was on a number of occasions, this is terribly unjust. This is unbelievable in the modern society, after all we've been through, that they're still actually saying that you have no right to your own flesh and blood. Your own flesh and blood have no right to know you, to be protected in their relationship with you. I said, this is unbelievable. Yeah. But I know what to do. I simply go back to my compadres, my left-leaning liberal compadres in journalism and in politics that I would be hanging out with and promoting and helping for the last how many years, and they would immediately say, oh my God, John, that's terrible, we hadn't known, but now we know, we're going to do something. And so I said, come quickly, look at this, look at what I found. And they started kicking my head in. Wow. And they just kicked and kicked and kicked for years. And they tried to drive me out of journalism. They tried to drive me out of the Irish Times. They threatened me in all kinds of ways.
Not the reaction you were expecting from them, probably.
Not at least. And then I had all kinds of difficulties getting stuff into print about this because of the in-camera rules. And I mean, I wrote a lot. And of course, I became almost like for several years, it's hard. It's a strange thing happened, that maybe from the late 90s through to the early 2000s, I became almost like, this strange figure who wrote about these things and everybody hated, the idea was that I never wrote about anything else, which wasn't true, but that's what people said, and people just repeated this, and you're the guy that's always banging on about fathers, and that was the kind of general thing. And then for some reason, that kind of lifted, and I became rehabilitated, even though I was still writing about this to relatively the same extent. I don't know why that was. It was, I think, a number of people in broadcasting kind of reached out to me and brought me back in and allowed me to talk about other things. And you'd have to say Tom McGurk was one, and Eamon Dunphy was another, and he was on Today FM at the time, you know, and he and I have always had a kind of an odd relationship, you know, on off, and very much, you know, tempestuous, I would say, you know, in the sense that we either love each other or hate each other at any given time. But, you know, he was a great broadcaster. I have to say about Dunphy that he was a great broadcaster, and, you know, he you know, that program, that show he did, The Last Word on Today FM, I think, Radio Ireland, I think it was called initially. It was a phenomenal program. Like he reinvented radio in that program. So, you know, like, he deserves credit for that, no matter what.
So they weren't all, there wasn't like this 100% definite certain consensus on you, and like one of them were against you. They were all against you. It wasn't as black and white as that.
But it was because of kind of mavericks. If you think the McGurk and Dunphy are quite similar in lots of ways. Like, they're older men who've been around a long time and have a balanced view of what's missing from the conversation, and they're not afraid to stand up for, you know, different voices, and that's gone now. That's gone now that those guys are pretty much gone off the scene. So those are the three things, you know: the alcoholism, the Prague, and having a child, which kind of made me really start re-examining everything, because I kind of thought, if these people are so hypocritical to call themselves, you know, liberals and egalitarians,
humanitarians, etc.
And they don't have any interest in this fundamental abuse of human rights that's happening right in front of their nose because it's ideologically not on their list.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, then, if they're that hypocritical, I'm not interested in anything they have to say.
So these were your catalysts for your own personal kind of raising the consciousness.
And there was an additional thing of stopping drinking, which is quite important, which is that you know, when you're a journalist and you're drinking, you tend to mix with other journalists at night. And I did that for a long time, and a lot of it was great. Like, I had some great friends, but also polices your thinking. You know, you're brought into a kind of, you know, you're kind of, the corners are knocked off you. Whereas when you go home, you stop drinking, you go home. You can read, you can think freely, and you don't really care so much what your colleagues think, because you're not meeting them so much in that social situation. And that's kind of where I got the freedom then to actually write about all this stuff, and did so for, you know, nearly 20 years. Like, so at the end of that, I suppose I had almost nothing in common with the mainstream of Irish journalism. They were all of the same mindset that I had been in the beginning. They hadn't made the slightest even rudimentary attempt to question it, whereas I'd kind of said, well, none of this stacks up. I'm going to have to go back to first principles and rebuild the whole picture.
Some examples of the recent political correctness stuff that's really starting to get out of hand. And I know it's been a gradual sort of, you know, increase of the madness. We had Kevin Hart recently, you know, stepped down from doing the Oscars, the black comedian, because of the tweets he made years ago. We had Frank Loesser's song, I think, "Baby It's Cold Outside," being banned. Apparently it's a date rape song. And then Shane McGowan having to defend the lyrics of Fairy Tale New York because of the faggot word. And then we had some of the I won't name them, but some of the 2FM presenters here defending it, the usual virtue signalling stuff. So the virtue signalling has become, they weren't defending it, they were saying it should be banned. I mean, they were defending the PC response. Sure. And so did you notice that the virtue signalling stuff, is there any particular point over the last few years, or even during your career, when you noticed that was starting to become really prevalent, journalists with this particular mindset?
Well, I was long aware of political correctness as a kind of hazy, muzzy kind of phenomenon that was somehow governing all of the issues that I was writing about. You know, I was setting off the tripwires all the time. And it took me a long time before I steered round and actually started looking at this concept of political correctness, because, you know, for a long time it appeared to be, you know, that what you were running foul of was a particularly kind of rigid and slightly, you know, peevish insistence upon defending certain people and categories of people, but in a good way, but broadly, you know, unexceptionable. Mm-hmm. But that it just went too far, and that but then I realised actually that there was much more than that. that it was actually a program of censorship. And in fact, that it occurred to me then that the actual name political correctness is a barrier to understanding what it is, because the word correctness implies that exactly that it's actually, people may be excessively trying to be correct in all of their understanding of everything, and that if you're incorrect, that there's something kind of ropey about that, maybe, that, okay, a joke may be incorrect, it's a joke, but it's still a little bit off, so in a certain sense that it's almost like a cop who does things by the book, and that kind of cop can become unpopular a little bit, but nevertheless you can't fault him objectively for doing his job. And the same way I think political correctness had that image, but then over the years I gradually kind of came to see that it was actually nothing like that at all, that it was actually part of an ideological program, and that all the different trips that it had in it were programmed to defend the ideology and to promote the ideology, which was all about power. That these groups that were protected, whether they were women, gays, blacks, whatever it was, that they were victim groups, yes. Yeah. But the idea was to weaponize those groups against people who wanted to kind of, draw attention to the imbalances that were now developing as a result of emphasizing the rights of these people over all other people.
Yeah, at the expense of others.
Yeah, so women over men, gays over straights, blacks over whites.
Which means oppression, actually, ironically.
Yeah.
When you prioritise one group.
Exactly. And I was dealing with that very immediately in the context of men. And it was quite extraordinary to see, how that was, playing out. Because, I remember actually, because I would issue the challenge, like I've said to you, why is it that it's okay to defend women but not men? Like, why if men are being discriminated against and being brutalised by judges and all that, why is that not an issue that people who are concerned with justice ought to be concerned with?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And
the double standard there.
Yeah, and some people, in fairness, were unable to answer this question. I remember actually Niall Stokes, my former editor from Currach Press, actually, I think I provoked him to he invited me to write an article, which I did, about this in their time. But unfortunately, he then set Ivana Bacik on me. Like, you see, that's the thing they can't do, is simply let you, if it was the other way around, Ivana Bacik would just write an article about feminism and that would be the end of it. They would never ask John Waters to respond to it.
Yeah, to justify or to rebuttal or whatever.
Yeah, but this was now, you could only have John Waters if you made sure to actually have him rebutted comprehensively, allegedly, by somebody, and that kind of thing would happen, so I began to look askance at all this and think, wow, this is strange, and I was getting huge pressure in the Irish Times, and yet nobody could actually say to me comprehensively, what you're saying is untrue. I mean, they might sort of rhetorically say that, but they couldn't. And a few people did try to say that, and I'd say, well, here are the facts that I've accumulated, and can you tell me this isn't true? And then Bob Geldof came out, and of course everybody ran away, because Geldof is culturally powerful. And so there was no attacks on him from here in Ireland, where he comes from anyway. There may be some people in England did attack him a little bit, but nobody in Ireland attacked Geldof, even though he was saying exactly the same things as I was.
Wow, okay, I see.
So
yeah, there's very little, it's not about justice or morality or anything. No. It's about certain people are open to be attacked.
And Geldof never suffered for saying the things he said, even though he said them very loudly. I mean, I have to give Geldof total credit. He didn't kind of spare the horses when he went out. He really gave it waskey, and I was really grateful. I mean, it was the cavalry coming. When I saw Geldof riding over the hill, I said, "Whoa, the cavalry's here!" and I think that may have been the factor actually that liberated me a little bit, and made them kind of maybe silently say, "Oh, well, maybe we better just back off this a bit, because
maybe he's onto something.
There could be other people coming over the hill as well, So, but a bit of that, and there was a kind of a grudging acknowledgement that there was an issue, I think, from time to time. And I also brought up lots of other issues like, male suicide, like the fact that the figures were skewed so badly that if it were the other way around, we would talk about nothing else.
Exactly, yeah.
And so on, and then then the real one was the one real problematic one was when I started to talk about domestic violence, and this is a weird one because when I started to discover, when I look into domestic violence, I was actually quite shocked. I mean, because I had bought into the story that was being told so comprehensively.
Yeah, it was one-sided.
Domestic violence was actually wife beating. That was the analysis, right?
Yeah, that's how people see it when they hear it.
But then somebody said to me one day, well, that's not true. Mm-hmm. And Dad said, look up a woman called Erin Peatsy, who was one of the earliest advocates, one of the earliest feminists in England, and also she had started the first domestic violence shelter for women. And she said within a few weeks she discovered that most of the women who came in were as violent as the men they had left.
Yeah.
And she started to investigate from then. And out of that came like a science which shows comprehensively that domestic violence is a 50-50 phenomenon. It breaks down differently in different categories, but broadly it's a 50-50, and men suffer as much as women. Yeah. Pretty much that's the statistical situation. And I remember actually writing that, and that was absolute uproar.
Of course.
Women, the feminist groups would have press conferences and attack me, and my colleagues would, of course, report these with abandon and never ask my opinion about it. And
yet it's the truth.
It's the
truth. What you're saying is the truth.
Yeah, but then the Department of Health commissioned a report, a study of studies, and to debunk what I was saying, and they got a reputable research company to do it, and they were to study all the international research. And I was waiting. I said, "Okay, bring it on," but it never came. And after maybe nearly a year, I started wondering, where is the report? And so I found out what the name of the company was, and I rang up that guy. It was Kieran McKeown, an associate, I think was the company's name. And I rang up Kieran McKeown and I had a very interesting conversation with him. I said, "Kieran, have you done this research?" And he says, "Yes, I have." And I said, "And it hasn't appeared?" And he says, "No, it hasn't." And I says, "Why?" And he says, "Well, when I tell you what's in it, you will know why." And he said, "Well, we've discovered that what you say is true."
That's why it didn't.
And eventually, it came out then. Eventually, when I wrote about it, they then published it on on the Department of Health website, accompanied again by a rebuttal by an American male feminist, a guy called Michael Kemmel. A completely fatuous analysis of this factual scientific research.
To twist it back to their
ideological rebuttal. Yeah. And so this is again the same syndrome, that when you actually bring out the facts, they will not treat them with any gravity or respect.
That's what you're up against.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my experience of that, out of that I became a kind of somebody who was seen as a contrarian. And this is an interesting concept, because the idea of being a contrarian or a controversialist implies that, first of all, that you're actually only vexatiously coming up with arguments that are contrary to the consensus, which is not what I was doing at all.
What you mean just for the sake of it?
Yeah, and just gratuitous argument. The other thing it implies is that if you're a contrarian, that means that there is something that you're opposing which is the truth. There is a version of reality which is true, which they have. And anybody who doesn't agree with that is a contrarian.
All right.
So therefore, all debate is really obsolete. The best you can ever hope for is that you will actually be wrong. You'll be allowed to speak, but it will be known and acknowledged and made clear to everybody that you are wrong about everything. And if you agree to that, then they're quite happy to have you around.
Because it's in the end, you're still no threat.
Yeah, because media now is kind of like drama, has been for quite a while. It's like I always say to people, and I became aware of this gradually, that when I was on TV or on radio as the contrarian, I was actually fulfilling a function from the point of view of the monolithic consensus. I was buttressing that consensus by agreeing to be there and to be demonstrably wrong, to be proven by weight of numbers and by the position of the so-called moderator and so on. I mean, the moderator would, throw in, dismissive comments when you would get to, if you were in danger of winning the argument, which very often would happen. The moderator was the one who would close you down. So it was a drama to demonstrate to the public the nature of error. And to make you the kind of the scapegoat of correctness.
You know, the way where we talked about it's obvious nowadays the ideological kind of leanings of the media, and of course nowadays the journalists and the writers are like the foot soldiers in a way in the media, but of course all structures have that pyramid type structure.
Yeah.
And I mean, with the so-called progressive left-leaning stuff, at what level do you think the media foot soldiers, is it at educational level or employment level where they start to kind of go that way? You know what I mean? Where they start to believe in this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two waves in journalism. I mean, there's an old wave and a new wave. And the old wave is kind of 60s radicals. People who went through the university system, maybe UCD, Trinity and all those colleges from the 70s onwards, and who became, radicalized from a left perspective. And there's quite a number of those in the media still, and they're the older heads now. And then the newer wave is people who have gone through the college system, journalism courses, who have been radicalized by professors who derive from that first wave, who have basically indoctrinated them in a form of Marxism. Which, I mean, the term that is used most often now for this is cultural Marxism, which is to some extent a limited concept, because there's more to it than Marxism. It's quite complex. There's a lot of elements of Freudianism and nihilism and Nietzscheanism and all kinds of isms that are mixed in there, and so that's kind of how. But it's important to understand that this is a cultural phenomenon, as far as I can make out, as far as I can have been able to, because people talk about this in a kind of conspiratorial way, as if kind of the whole thing is orchestrated from the top. And you mentioned a hierarchy and a pyramid. I'm not certain that the top of that pyramid is all that important, because I've often felt that all those guys, the guys owners of newspapers, all they want is two things really. One is that they make lots of money, and that the whatever the media organisation is does nothing to interfere with that, their ability to make more money. And once it doesn't do that, then they're not interested. They don't care what's in it, so long as it's
that's
popular.
The motivation. Yeah.
So in a sense, that has left the field to the cultural Marxists, who have basically, a lot of autonomy, and they particularly have a lot of autonomy for two reasons. One is that the internet has put such pressure on media that they're actually hemorrhaging readers and viewers and listeners, and as a result of that, you've lost a lot of editorial authority, because the old editors just didn't know what to do in the face of this, and they were replaced very quickly by people who were internet savvy, who may be internet savvy, but they know absolutely nothing about journalism and don't care. And so all the value systems that we used to obtain in newspapers, the kind of checks and balances that were so important. I mean, because when I went to the Irish Times, it was impressed upon me, and it's only in 1990, that as a columnist in the Irish Times, I was carrying, in a sense, the masthead around with me, and that, I had to be mindful of that in the way I behaved towards people and treated people and spoke to people, and ordinary people, as it were, but also, people like priests and bishops and judges and all those, and then I was meeting all those people, and I was expected to be respectful and not to kind of assume that I had a right to treat them as I might have treated them were it simply a matter of John Waters, that I was representing the Irish Times. And that's all gone now. You can do what you like now. The Irish Times does nothing to contrail. That was a lot of my experience when I eventually left the Irish Times, that nobody in the Irish Times cared what anybody did in the name of the Irish Times. They could use the masthead any way they liked, and and nobody said anything. And so that's essentially what's happened. An infection by cultural Marxism, which is completely widespread now in the media, and there's almost no pocket of dissent in the Irish media. I don't think there is any, actually.
Yeah, non-significant anyway.
No, I mean in the UK media, you have some elements, like the Spectator, for example, and in American media, you have lots of different magazines, like National Review and so on, and the Drudge Report, and you have Fox News and all that. I mean, there's a variety of platforms. In Ireland, there's none. It's entirely culture and Marxism, or what is called culture and Marxism, and their function is not simply to promote the ideology. Their function includes the assassination of anybody who doesn't promote the ideology or who seeks to oppose it or question it.
Yeah.
So they prosecute you if you. That's their function. If you actually look at, and the same is true in England. If you look at interviews now on the BBC or on RTE, they're like prosecutorial in their nature.
Yeah.
That the person is treated as if they were a defendant in a trial.
On trial, yeah, exactly. That's the feeling you get every time you see an interview like that.
Yeah. That isn't what journalism is. Like, journalism is to actually, if in this conversation we're having, to ask a question, elicit the view. If you think that the answer doesn't stack up, of course you have supplementary questions and so on, and you try to tease out, But the purpose is to actually allow the person to present their. It isn't a virtue signal to the audience that you don't like this person, which is now what journalism is in Ireland. I mean, if you look at people like Tubridy and Ray D'Arcy, these guys who get $500,000 a year for being public bully boys in relation to this ideology, it's extraordinary, because these people exist in a market which has no competition. Like, there's not as if there's anywhere they could go which would pay them more than they're getting already, and yet they get these extraordinary salaries for really just prating the orthodoxies. Yeah. That seems to be the most important thing they do, is to ensure that no dissent creeps in, that no unorthodoxy is permitted. That's amazing. I mean, when you see that. So, I think that what's actually happened is that all those organisations have been taken over by these cultural Marxists, not necessarily at the highest level, but intermediate levels, and nobody at the top cares what they do. There used to be a time when there was an editor upstairs or down on the newsroom who people were afraid of. It doesn't seem to happen anymore. People would, he would say, "What the hell are you doing?" Get on with your work.
Yeah. That's one of the damaging effects, because I've seen this carry on the last 10 years, getting increasingly worse in other Western countries. Like, I was in Australia, the UK, and this whole thing has been kicking off. And you're right, here it's a bit more, there's less of alternative kind of opinions, and it makes for very dull entertainment for me. Like, when I see someone being interviewed, like if you're being interviewed by Ryan Tubridy, which I doubt that scenario would happen, and I hope it doesn't.
It used to happen. Yeah, it did happen way back.
Yeah.
It was pretty dismal when it did, actually.
Yeah, well, now it would probably be even worse because of who you are and what you represent to someone like him, what he represents, and it makes for horrible. For someone like me who's aware of what they're doing, it's not entertaining at all, because I don't want to hear the interviewer or the presenter constantly churning out their opinions over the guests. Yeah. There's no point.
Yeah, and there's no benefit to the viewer or listener in having the presenter arrogate to himself or herself the role of putting down the person who's come in and given up their time to come into the studio to actually answer questions and to give presumably an interesting interview that would be informative and entertaining and interesting for the viewers or listeners. And all he does is interrupt and barrack and browbeat. This happened to me. I mean, when my book Collapsed Agnostic that I mentioned came out in 2008, I think it was, I had the misfortune of agreeing to go on his show on the radio, and Tubridy, and when I arrived in the studio, I was interviewed to death beforehand by a researcher, for hours, twice.
Wow.
And the researcher had read the book in detail and was very interested in it, and so I thought, this is going to be some hell of an interview, and I hope it's going to be long. And I was told, it'll be half an hour, and so I arrived in the studio, and Tubridy wasn't there. He was down in Cork, and he was bizarrely, he was on a link remotely. Usually, and it's very unsatisfactory. Usually, it's the other way around, that the guest is on a remote link. It's almost unheard of that the presenter is on a remote link, and from a satellite studio. And immediately, rather than talking about my book, he immediately started going on about what I was writing about fathers, and which had been going on now for like a dozen years or so, and men and gender and sex and all of this stuff, you know. And
that wasn't in the brief that you would have.
Nothing to do with it. Nobody told me. No. And he just kept going on, and like the time was like 20 minutes had passed, and finally he came around the book, and he had clearly, it was quite obvious he hadn't read the book, and he had only 2 questions, and they're amazing questions. He started saying, he summarised the book in some clumsy way, and then he says, do you pray? So I kind of says yes, and tried to answer that as best I could, like totally out of context, no, and then like actually there was a chapter in the book about how I pray and what prayer means and all that. He hadn't read it, and then the second question was, does it not bother you not being cool? And I said, well...
Yeah. That was his question?
Yeah, that was his question, yeah. And I said, well, Ryan, you know, I'm 53 years of age. It's about time I stopped worrying about those things. You know?
You put him in his box, he's being childish, so... That's
but these guys are paid huge salaries by the public to actually help them to understand their culture and their society and their structures as human beings and how the thing works. And this is what they do. Yeah. And still collect their wages. You know, and
they shouldn't be paid at all for doing that.
Should be, in my view, he should have been fired immediately for that interview, because he clearly hadn't done his job. I mean, and the researcher's time was wasted. Not only did he waste my time, but the researcher's time was wasted, because he clearly hadn't even read the brief.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's very, very, I think, serious. And then, I mean, that just goes on. And I mean, like, I could bore you for hours with the number of sabotages that there have been on me in those contexts when I stupidly agreed to do interviews on particular topics, set up by some smartass wanting to simply... You know, I had this idea like that, there was a particular pub somewhere out there in the country, maybe not, or in the city, that they used to go to, these presenters, and that there would be their mates would be there and watching. And the most important thing about the interview was that they'd not say or do anything other than to make sure that their mates would approve of them and say, right on Brendan, right on Ryan, right on Ray, whatever it would be.
Like a gang or something.
Yeah. And that you'd walked into this nonsense. So I think that, I have repeatedly in the last year, since I started going around the country talking about the Eighth Amendment, I've asked audiences if they can tell me why this is. That if you have a local radio station which plays maybe country music and a little bit of news and a bit of local talk and death notices, you have to apply for a license every 5 years.
Yeah, the BAI and all the stuff. Yeah.
The national broadcaster has never really applied for the license. It's been operating for nearly a century now.
Like, I didn't know that. It's fascinating, actually.
Yeah, why is that?
Yeah.
Why not have a competition so that other consortiums can come up and say, okay, we are now going to serve the Irish people in this way, or in this way, or in this way. We feel there's something here that's missing from the way RT behaves.
How can we improve on...
it wouldn't be hard.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe that's why they have it set up that way, because they know very well if you had another... Because I mean, it's a big world and things have changed. If you... I know it's the state broadcaster, but if you had another broadcasting company that came in who was allowed to have, a fair share of the market or whatever to get going, they might easily upstage them.
Well, I mean, you have TV3, but what I'm talking about is actually replacing them. Mm. So that they, in other words, that they're given notice, maybe, I don't know, 2 years. On the 31st of December 2020, RTE's license lapses.
Right.
And they have to reapply. And others can apply as well. And RTE puts forward their proposal and deals with the questions that are legitimate questions which are raised. Why do you do this?
Yeah.
Why did you take out Sean Gallagher and never apologise? Do you have anything to say about the fact that a president has been in place for 7 years in Ireland and has been re-elected, who should never have been elected at all, but actually was elected because of RTE's corruption?
Yeah, to hold them accountable for all this stuff.
The Father Kevin Reynolds libel, same thing. There's countless examples.
Yeah.
That's, in other words, that they would have to account for their stewardship of that licence. And I don't think they would actually come out of it very well. And then to be up against people who would be saying, well, actually, we would like to give a fair shake to people who have different viewpoints. We actually would like to do documentaries about why fathers are being brutalised in family courts, which RTE has never done. We think that it's a bit unhealthy when we see broadcasters who are paid for them out of the licence fee celebrating with LGBT people because they've won a referendum. We don't think that. We think that's a bit off.
Yeah, it's very biased and it's supposed to be impartial.
Indeed, you know what I mean. It's a shocking thing, actually. It's a shocking thing, and I mean, it's not just RTE. I mean, I don't appear. I haven't been appearing on certain programs for a long time, and the Vincent Brown show was one because myself and Vincent used to be very friendly, and I mean, we didn't fall out. We just agreed to differ about certain things, and but I went on with him when I was in referendums. When I was campaigning in referendums, I would go on. Partly because I knew that he was constrained by the legislation in the way that he could behave, because he just behaved appallingly if he wasn't constrained. And as a result, at the end of the marriage equality referendum, the day before, I got a call saying I had been on a couple of times, I think, on his show, and I'd been on debating Micheál Martin, I remember clearly, and I got a call from researchers saying, would I come on the post-referendum review or whatever it was, the analysis program. I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. And they said, okay, that's it. And then they said, it's actually, it's in the George pub, we're having it. I said, sorry? Are you serious? You're serious? That you think a referendum which hasn't happened yet, and you're going to have it in the headquarters on one side? You don't know the result? I mean, and you think I'm going to go in and offer myself up in that environment to be, whatever the outcome? Not a chance. But that's the kind of way media have gone in Ireland. That would have been unthinkable in any context in media, even 10 years ago. Now, anything goes. And as a result, it's all going. The circulation of newspapers has gone through the floor. The quality of radio and television has gone through the floor, and that's the only way they can keep their audiences up, because they're dumbing down all the time and reducing to the lowest common denominator. And I mean, it's pretty appalling at every level, So I don't have anything to do with it anymore. I don't appear in radio or television. I haven't for years, I mean, I have a book out at the moment now, and I've done a few local radio interviews, maybe half a dozen. And I haven't had any invitations from the national media, I have to say. But if I had, I would turn them down. Because, again, I'm not willing to be put on trial for the delectation of the friends of Ryan Tubridy or whoever it might be.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, from what I can see, a culture within the media where they, I'm sure, there's money involved, there's careers involved, people, especially who are coming up through the ranks, they can use personnel changes to bring people in who will go ahead with the agenda. And you mentioned the thing at the George, but even organising events and dealing with issues in that way and dealing with political developments in that way, they can find out very clearly who's in and who's out.
Yeah, but what is really remarkable about it, is that for a number of years now, I felt that when you go into a radio or television station, you are surrounded by activists who are, in their heads, your opponent, if not your enemy. Even though they've invited you in because you have, in theory, a legitimate point of view, or you think that's why you should be invited in. No, it's not. It's so they can set you up to bury you in front of their friends and to make sure that nobody would criticise them on their side for having failed to nail Waters when he came in, or get him off the hook, or let him to actually get the upper hand over whoever. And that's how it's all set up, and you'd be a fool to participate in a circus like that.
Yeah, and well, actually on that point, just for our last kind of item, the whole incident with Peter Casey on the Late Late Show, Now, you know, of course, he's gone into the political sphere, and I'm not a fan of politics or political people in general. If they're doing their job well, you know, that's fine. But I'm more interested in the culture and how the media is operating. And you looked at the way, you know, after the election, he was, I think it was 2 weeks after, he was on the Late Late Show, and Tubridy interviewed him, and it was clear that there was a setup, and it was like, even though the threat of him winning the presidency was now gone, they still decided to make an example of him, and they did it in that typical way. But they also used you know, audience plants from the traveller community who had a prepared attack, and it's clearly very important to them to shoot down anyone, like you said, who challenges the status quo like that.
Yeah, well, I didn't see that, but I've heard a lot about it from different people, and I have a fair idea of what went down, and what went down is pretty much standard behaviour now in media, that, you know, Casey had to be punished. They did a similar thing, I think, to Nigel Farage on the Late Late Show from London there around the same time, and you know, it's like the whole point is that the presenter gets to actually demonstrate his repugnance of the guest. That seems to be the ethic, if you can call it that, at play, and but you see, like, just to say on the whole presidential thing, I mean, I was looking askance at that whole thing, because it really was a circus, you know, and that's a function of what media have done to politics, and also what politics has done to politics. I mean, like, because, you know, politics is now meaningless in a situation where you have a government which was not elected by anybody other than by themselves and each other, and you have no opposition, because they're stitched in, well, partly because they're stitched into the governmental agreement. So there's no opposition now. You know, people like me have been out for the last year campaigning on the 8th Amendment. We're doing the job of Micheál Martin. He's collecting the salary, we're doing the work.
Of actually opposing the
of doing, you know, because opposition is like, is vital part of any democracy. You know, like, opposition is like the defence in a prosecution. You know, I mean,
exactly, yeah.
You know, if I'm accused of a crime, I go to a solicitor, and he asks me what happened. I give him my side of the story. He doesn't have to like me. He doesn't have to agree with me about everything. He just has to go to actually put my point of view to the court.
So there's a balance there. There needs to be two sides.
That's right, because that's how you get the truth to come out. And the same applies to democratic discourse. But the opposition have abdicated their responsibility, which means that ordinary citizens have to step forward.
Yeah, without all the funding and
pro bono,
resource.
And be absolutely pilloried by these cultural Marxists who are paid for out of the license fees, etc., etc. And so the result is that you know, the whole thing has become like a little bit like, you know, what you find then is that you know, I thought that I actually think that there should be higher barriers to people going for the presidency. I mean, I have come to the view that actually the old way, which became disparaged over the last year since 1990, that the old idea that it should be, the presidency should be for a politician who had paid his or her dues and was a credible and authoritative figure in Irish life, that should have remained. Not necessarily, I suppose, a politician, maybe a great poet might be equally, but that the election then should be run in very careful way, in commensurate with the dignity of the office, because this is the highest office in the land. And you can't say that about this campaign. I mean, it was a circus, and the media were just trying to assassinate the characters of people. I mean, I know for a fact that one newspaper group actually put it about that if Jim O'Doherty ran for the presidency, they would destroy her. This is a scandal beyond belief.
Wow.
So there was no credibility of any of this.
And it's out in the open. How they're acting.
Yeah, and then you see Peter Casey. I mean, I thought personally that there was a degree of cynicism about Peter Casey's intervention, those statements he made. It seemed to me that he was at the bottom of the league, and he wanted to get himself off it. And he played a couple of Trumpian cards, as he saw it. But I think that's trivialising the whole thing, because Trump is actually a very significant figure. and has very significant support for very significant reasons, which is another story.
So they're kind of not comparable, but similar technique.
Trump doesn't just say things for effect. There's a coherence to Trump's whole worldview, even though the media don't tell you anything, don't do any proper analysis of Trump. The most important thing about Trump is that he's a builder, and he's the guy who arrived on the site and put on the hard hat. He was wearing a suit, but he put on the hard hat, and he went down and he spoke to the crane driver, and he spoke to the guys up on the scaffolding. He climbed up the scaffolding and he spoke to those guys, and he went down into the foundations and he spoke to the guys down there. And these guys all love him, and that's how Trump got elected, fundamentally, at a macro level. Now, Peter Casey wasn't any of that. He was just pushing certain buttons, and quite cynically, in my opinion. And then afterwards, of course, he did an interview, ironically, with my old magazine, Hot Press, in which he basically describes himself or revealed himself as completely opposite to the impression he'd given. Like, he'd given the impression during the campaign that he was kind of what is called a conservative. Well, now he turns out in his interview at Hot Press that he's pro-abortion, pro-euthanasia and pro-gay marriage.
Oh, wow.
So, what was all that about? I mean, it struck me actually, if you wanted to actually conduct a controlled explosion on the idea of what is called populism in Irish life, it wouldn't be a bad idea to get a likely lad, put him up for the presidency, with the very idea of drawing all of that populist vote to himself, and then making a skit of it, then basically flipping it and saying, I'm not that anyway, fooled you. And that's kind of what happened. I don't know if that's actually what happened literally, but it's one possible explanation for it, and it ought not be. It ought not be an explanation for what's happened. I mean, politics is too serious for these kinds of games, if games they are.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, whether or not that was the case, that was some sort of experiment. Like I was saying, that's kind of why I don't get sucked into the details too much of the dynamics of the different characters involved, because it is a circus.
I could sympathise a lot more with you now, Emmett, on that than I would have even a short few years ago. I mean, I was very much immersed in politics as a journalist and as a writer, and I wrote, several books, or the greater part of a lot of my books was concerned with politics in different ways. But now, I think because of the corruption of the media and the connected in corruption of politics, because it is, if you look at the way that Fianna Fáil under Micheál Martin basically left its post for two referendums, the gay marriage referendum and the abortion referendum, left its post and left vacant the role of chief prosecutor of this question, and left it for lay people, unpaid, pro bono, to do that work. You see that was in response, in part, to the intimidation of a corrupt media. And they didn't want to run foul. They didn't want to be seen as reactionary. They didn't want to be seen as conservative. They wanted to appeal to the millennium vote. There were other factors as well. There were, the whole... because indeed, as I said often, Irish politicians are no longer leaders. They are messengers. They know that if you become Taoiseach, it doesn't matter what you believe. The day after you become Taoiseach, you will go into a room somewhere and there will be people there who will tell you what you are going to believe from then on out. Mm-hmm. And why? Because then the reason why is that you can't lead Ireland. You cannot be the leader of the Irish government unless you believe certain things, or at least pretend to believe those things. And that's kind of what's happened to our politics now. So you're dead right. If you're not cynical about Irish politics now, then you don't know what's happening.
This is Resolving Reality. Thanks for watching. That was my conversation with John Waters, author and former journalist. Take a look at John's website, www.johnwaters.ie. You can find out more information about him and his work, including his many books. And you can visit www.currachbooks.com to get John's latest book, Give Us Back the Bad Roads, and those links are in the description below. Please support Resolving Reality, an independent Irish media platform. Like, comment, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe. Make sure you visit the Resolving Reality website to find all of the Resolving Reality links and profiles, and to check out the Resolving Reality radio podcasts. That website is www.resolvingreality.com. Once again, thanks for watching. Until next time, and enjoy Resolving Reality.